She never threw away his coffee mug. For 60 years it sat on the second shelf of her kitchen cabinet, chipped on the rim, faded around the handle, still carrying the ghost of a fingerprint she refused to wash away. People thought it was grief that kept it there. But Margaret always said it was something else. It was certainty. She knew, somewhere deep in the marrow of her bones, that the story wasn't finished yet. It was the summer of 1952 when Robert Calloway walked into her life carrying nothing but a crooked smile and a borrowed bicycle. She was 19, working the counter at her father's hardware store in Millhaven, Ohio, a town so small that strangers were an event. He wasn't from there, just passing through on his way to visit a cousin. And somehow that visit stretched into 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks stretched into a lifetime of letters and phone calls and a wedding planned for the following June. Robert had dark hair that fell across his forehead when he laughed, and he laughed often. He made everything feel warmer, like the world had been operating at the wrong temperature before he arrived. They got engaged in October. By February, he was gone. The Korean War didn't ask for permission. It didn't care about wedding plans or the yellow dress Margaret had already bought, or the way Robert used to trace the outline of her hand like he was memorizing it. His draft notice came on a Thursday. He shipped out on a Monday. At the train station, he pressed his dog tag into her palm, one of the two he wore around his neck, and closed her fingers around it. "Keep it warm," he said. "I'll be back for it." She laughed because she thought he was being dramatic. She didn't know that laugh would have to last her a very long time. His letters came faithfully for 4 months. Then they slowed. Then they stopped. The military notification arrived in August of 1953. Not a death certificate, but something almost worse. Missing in action. 3 words that meant everything and nothing at the same time. No body, no confirmation, no closure. Just a yawning silence where a person used to be. Margaret's mother told her to grieve and move on. Her father told her she was young and life was long. But Margaret placed that coffee mug on the shelf, tucked his other dog tag, she'd found it in the pocket of the jacket he'd left behind, into a small cedar box, and quietly decided she would wait for the truth, however long it took. She built a life around the waiting. She taught 3rd grade for 31 years at Millhaven Elementary, and was the kind of teacher children never forgot. The kind who remembered birthdays and noticed when someone came to school without having eaten breakfast. She never remarried, though a kind man named Harold asked her twice in the 1960s. She was fond of Harold. She just wasn't free in the way he needed her to be. Some part of her heart was still standing at that train station with her fingers curled around a piece of metal. Decades move the way decades do, in slow accumulations of ordinary days that somehow add up to a whole life. She watched the world change from her kitchen window. She raised a garden. She read books. She loved her nieces and nephews with a ferocity that surprised even her. And every year on the date Robert had shipped out, she made a pot of his favorite coffee, black, 2 sugars, poured 1 cup for herself, and left the mug on the table for a quiet hour before washing it and putting it back on the shelf. When Margaret was 79, her grandniece Kara came to stay with her for the summer. Kara was 24, finishing a graduate degree in history, and she had her great-aunt's same stubborn streak dressed up in modern clothes. One evening, going through the cedar box that sat on Margaret's nightstand, Kara held up the dog tag and said quietly, "Aunt Maggie, have you ever tried to find out what happened? Like really tried? There are organizations now, databases, DNA registries." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "I've spent 60 years being patient," she said. "I suppose I can spend a little more time being brave." What followed was 8 months of phone calls, submitted forms, and a patience that would have broken a younger woman. Kara contacted the Defense POWMIA accounting agency. She submitted Robert's name, his unit, his last known coordinates from his final letter. She sent a photograph, Robert squinting against the sun somewhere outside of Seoul, laughing at something off camera, alive in the way only young people can be alive, like the world hasn't had the nerve to touch them yet. Margaret gave a DNA sample on a Tuesday morning, sitting at a folding table in a VFW hall, an elderly woman in a lavender cardigan, holding out her arm without trembling. Then came the morning that rearranged everything. Kara answered the phone because Margaret had stepped outside to water her tomatoes. When Margaret came back in, dirt still on her gloves, she knew from the way Kara was standing, very still, one hand over her mouth, that something enormous had shifted. "Aunt Maggie," Kara said, and her voice broke in the middle of those two words. "They found him." The remains of Corporal Robert Calloway had been recovered from a hillside in North Korea as part of a repatriation effort, identified through dental records and the DNA match from Margaret's sample. He had not run. He had not survived in secret. He had died on that hillside in October of 1953, 2 months after he was listed as missing, fighting to hold a position his unit had been ordered to hold. He had been 23 years old. He had been, by every account from his surviving unit members who were eventually tracked down, the kind of soldier who told jokes in the dark to keep the other men from being afraid. Margaret sat down in her kitchen chair and didn't speak for a long time. Kara sat with her and didn't try to fill the silence with words, which was exactly right. Outside, the tomato plants moved in the small wind. The coffee mug sat on its shelf. Finally, Margaret said, "He didn't leave me." It wasn't a question. She already knew the answer. She had always known the answer. But there is a difference between knowing something in your bones and having the world confirm it out loud. And that difference is its own kind of grief and its own kind of grace. The burial was held on a Saturday in September at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Margaret sat in the front row in a navy blue dress, her white hair pinned neatly, her back straight as a schoolteacher's. Kara sat beside her. The nieces and nephews and their children filled several rows behind them, a family that had grown up in the shadow of a man they'd never met but had somehow always known. When the bugler played taps, something in Margaret's face shifted. Not broke, not crumbled, but opened. The way a door opens that has been shut for a very long time. They presented her with the folded flag with the quiet formality the military keeps for these moments, and she held it against her chest like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. Then a young officer stepped forward and held out a small sealed bag. Inside it, barely visible through the plastic, was a dog tag. Robert's, the one he'd been wearing when he died, the one that had been recovered with his remains. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her navy dress and pulled out the dog tag she had carried for 60 years, the one he had pressed into her hand at the train station. She held them side by side in her open palm, and for just a moment she closed her eyes. "There you are," she whispered. On the drive home, Kara asked her gently how she was feeling. Margaret looked out the car window at the Maryland landscape passing by, the trees just beginning to turn for autumn, the sky that particular shade of blue that only exists in September. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 60 years, she said quietly, "and I finally just let it go." She lived another 3 years after that. Good years, her family said, lighter somehow, like something heavy had been set down. She kept the coffee mug on the shelf until the end, but she moved the cedar box to the kitchen table, where she could see it in the morning when she made her coffee. Both dog tags were inside it now, together again, the way they had always been meant to be. At her memorial service, Kara read a line from one of Robert's letters that Margaret had kept folded in her Bible for 60 years. It said, "I think about you every morning when the light changes. I think you must be the reason the sun bothers coming up at all." There was not a dry eye in the room. But there was also something else in that room, something that doesn't have a clean name but that you recognize when you feel it. It was the weight of a love that had been faithful past all reason, that had outlasted war and silence and 60 years of ordinary Tuesdays, and had finally found its way home. Some people spend their whole lives searching for a love like that. Margaret Calloway spent hers simply keeping the coffee warm,